One of the insights that we are going to get from this course is called the incidence of taxation. The incidence of taxation is who really pays a tax. And the tax isn't necessarily paid by the entity that the government claims is going to be paying it. And as we're going to use the excise tax as a way to understand this concept of incidence. We're using the excise tax because it makes the arithmetic easier. But the concept of incidence applies to any kind of tax you might name. So, for example, a sales tax. Some of a sales tax is going to be paid by the consumer. Some is actually going to be paid by the seller or the producer. A payroll tax, as we discussed in class, some of that is paid by the employer himself or herself. Some of it is paid by the worker, and it really depends upon the supply and demand elasticities of labor. And most of the time, as I mentioned, the payroll tax is paid for by an employee. Part of it is being deducted from their paycheck, and the part that is paid by the employer is actually paid for by the worker in the form of lower wages. Another example would be the corporate profits tax. Sure, some of the corporate profits tax is paid by the investors and the owners of the company who have to pay a portion of their profits, but they may be able, because of elasticity of supply and demand, push some of that tax onto their employees in the form of lower wages, and even onto their customers in the form of higher prices. And as I'm sure you're aware, there's been a lot of debate recently about the issue of tariffs, which we'll talk about later in this semester in more detail, and how much of a tariff is going to be paid for by customers in the form of higher prices, paid by importers who have to absorb some of that cost when they bring the good into the country, and how much might actually even be absorbed by the suppliers and the manufacturers in the foreign nations who have to lower their prices because of the tariff that is going to be collected as it comes in. So, incidence of taxation, a very important concept in terms of the principles of microeconomics. And we're going to use the excise tax just as a very simple way to think about who really pays compared to who the government says is going to pay. So, let's use just a very simple example, milk. So let's say there's a market for milk, and we have a supply curve and a demand curve. And let's say this is a 10 up here, and that the intercept down here is at $1 a gallon, and that the equilibrium quantity is going to be 30 gallons of milk, and the equilibrium price is going to be $4 a gallon. And let's say that the government is just trying to raise some money, and they decide they're going to put a $3 tax, excise tax on milk. We could even say that they're going to put it on the milk producers, that milk producers have to pay an excise tax of $3 a gallon. Well, when there's an excise tax, it doesn't matter whether they say they're going to put it onto the consumer or onto the producer. The way we solve the problem of what's going to be the result of the excise tax is we have to find the point or the quantity where the demand curve is exactly $3 above the supply curve. Because what's going to happen is the customer is going to pay a certain amount for milk, the government's going to collect the $3 excise tax, and the producer keeps the difference. And so it turns out, and I obviously figured out the arithmetic before to make sure that this chart was going to work out correctly. If these are our supply and demand curve, then this is actually going to end up at $6, and this is going to end up at $3. So the customer is going to pay $6 a gallon. The government will collect $3, and the producer is going to keep $3. So a $3 excise tax on milk, where the demand curve had an intercept at 10 and went down to $4 at 30 gallons, and the supply curve had an intercept at 1 and had a $4 price at 30 gallons, so that would have been the equilibrium price and quantity, $4 a gallon at 30 gallons of milk. A $3 excise tax is going to raise the price for consumers to $6, and then the government will collect 3 and the producers keep 3. The important insight is that while the price was $4 before the tax, and there's now a $3 tax, we don't just add the $3 to the 4 and say that our new price is 7. We have to find the quantity where the demand curve is exactly $3 above the supply curve, because the quantity is going to fall to 20, because at $3, and that's all they're going to get, milk producers are only willing to produce 20 gallons when they're only going to get $3. And when the price is $6, consumers are only willing to buy $20 of 20 gallons. So we're still back at the equilibrium quantity after tax, because at $20, consumers are only, at $6, consumers are only willing to buy 20 gallons of milk. And at $3, which is the amount they're going to be getting, producers are only willing to produce 20 gallons of milk. So we get back to the situation where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. It's just that consumers are not paying the same price that producers are getting. It's because the government's going to collect $3, the difference between the 6 and the 3. So before the tax, when the quantity was 30, right, our producer surplus was 1/2 times 30 times the $4 that they were receiving before minus the $1 intercept. So this would have been 15 times 3, which is $45. And consumers were also buying 30 gallons of milk, because it's the same 30 that the sellers were selling, and that intercept was at 10, and the price was 4. So the consumer surplus was 15 times, half of 30 is 15 times 6, which is $90. And now with the $3 excise tax, all that changes. Consumer surplus is now the area still defined as the area under the demand curve above the price, but we have a new price that the consumers are paying, which is $6, and of course we have a new quantity. So the consumer surplus after the tax is 1/2 times 20 times 10 minus 6, which is 10 times 4, which is $40. And producers, same definition as before, the area under the price above the supply curve, but now this is not the price that the consumers pay, this is the price that the producers get to keep. So consumers face a different price than the producers, because the government's collecting $3 in between. So the producer surplus is now 1/2 times 20, same quantity of course, 3 minus 1, which of course is 10 times 2, which the producer surplus is now $20. The government is collecting $3 a gallon, and the government is collecting $3 a gallon, and we know there's 20 gallons. We just saw that the quantity at 20 is where the price after tax and the price after tax, the price after tax for the consumer and the price after the tax for the producer gets us to 20 gallons. So the government collects $3 for each gallon, and there are 20 gallons. So the government's going to collect $60. And just as with a price ceiling or a price floor or with a quota, whenever the quantity is reduced, there's going to be deadweight loss. So the quantity before was 30 gallons. Now that there's a tax, the quantity has fallen to 20. And so the deadweight loss is again a triangle because of the reduction in quantity. So it's 1/2 times 30 minus 20, and then it's and the height of the triangle is the amount of the tax, which is $3. So 30 minus 20 is 10, half of that is 5, times 3 is 15. So the deadweight loss because of the $3 tax on milk is $15.